Artur BETERBIEV versus Dmitry BIVOL. The hour is finally approaching. What a matchup. People have been asking me for this breakdown, so here it is. The battle of two undefeated light heavyweights. We have Artur BETERBIEV, who's 20-0 with a perfect 20 KOs, versus Dmitry BIVOL, 23-0 with 12 KOs. Now, the wonderful thing about this matchup and about doing this breakdown is that both fighters have such strong points in the same departments that it does make it a little bit challenging to do a breakdown. But therein lies the fun, right? Because we have to look at the subtle differences between the fighters in order to truly make a comparison. Now, thanks to the fact that both Artur and Dmitry are products of the Eastern European, specifically the Russian amateur boxing program, they both have very solid fundamentals. So it's really difficult to fault either fighter in the fundamentals department. They also both have extensive amateur careers, so they've developed that sense of ring IQ over the years of being amateurs, and then they've spent approximately the same amount of time in the pro ranks. So in that department, they're also on equal footing. Let's take a look at the technical strengths and weaknesses of both Artur BETERBIEV and Dmitry BIVOL, and then see how they match up. So we'll start with BIVOL. BIVOL's got a terrific jab. He has a strong penetrating jab, and he uses this to set up probably one of his best weapons, which is his straight right hand. Now, his jab right hand, his 1-2 flow very smoothly and very effectively, and he's able to peck away at his opponents with that 1-2. Once he feels that that's landing to his satisfaction, he'll drop in his left hook right behind the right hand. A second asset that Dmitry uses consistently is a strong guard. To that end, he always keeps his right hand up, very close to his face, and his left hand is a little more extended, kind of like a modified, typical Eastern European guard. He doesn't keep his left hand out as far as the Eastern Europeans do as amateurs, so it's a little bit closer to his head, but he uses that left hand as a probe, as a jab, a keep busy jab, although it's not really a jab with bad intentions. What Dmitry will do is try to use that left hand to, I think, create a distraction or try to create mental overload in his opponents by constantly just pushing his jab hand out, either in an upward angle, straight out, or slightly down. A third aspect of Dmitry BIVOL that I think is a real asset is something that comes both from a ring experience, ring IQ, as well as terrific conditioning, which is he is a wonderful finisher, and he can just he can string together a 20-punch combination. It's just pretty crazy. Once Dmitry knows he's broken his opponent down with the jabs and the 1-2s and the 1-2-3s, if he can push his opponent back towards the ropes or even the corner, when Dmitry smells the blood, so to speak, even though there may not even be any actual blood, he just unloads with non-stop punches. But they're all meaningful. They're not just a flurry for the sake of flurrying. They're effective punches. So again, to be able to do that in the later rounds of a fight points to the fact that he's always in terrific condition, and he just has that the ring IQ to know when to pour it on to finish off his opponent. Of course, the danger with pouring it on too early in the fight, so to speak, is if the opponent is able to weather that storm, you may have just depleted your own energy levels, and then it's possible that your opponent could then pull ahead in the upcoming rounds. But that's not the case with BIVOL. He knows when to step on the gas, so to speak. So now let's take a look at a few areas of concern with Dmitry BIVOL. Well, the first one I see is that he keeps his feet a little bit wide. His stance is a little wide, which means that in effect kind of just lowers his upper body, and that somewhat gives away a little bit of his height advantage. The second issue with keeping that wide stance is Dmitri's front leg, his left leg, is a little bit stiff. He doesn't quite lock his knee, but by keeping that front leg stiff, it limits his mobility to just being straight back and forth in a straight line. If you've got all the weight, or you've got your knee almost locked, as opposed to having soft knees, then it's very difficult to pivot on that lead left leg. It's also a little more problematic to start to shift, to try to move laterally instead of moving straight forward and backwards. Now, going sort of hand in hand with that wide stance, somewhat locked front leg, Dmitri's now sort of limited himself to moving straight back and straight forward, as if he was a fencer on that fencing track. And this could be a little problematic because what Dmitri's sort of general pattern is he'll throw his jab, maybe jab 1-2, going forward, and as his opponent responds with their attack, Dmitry kind of bounces straight back in a straight line. Now, for the most part, he's able to get away with it just because of the opposition he's faced, number one. Number two, because he has so much experience fighting that way that he's really become masterful at it. But it does limit him to that straight line motion. And it also does make it predictable as to what he's going to do when his opponent attacks. He's not going to necessarily cut out to his right or left and create an angle. No, he's going to go straight back. Third area of concern for Dmitry BIVOL is kind of goes hand in hand with the stance and the moving straight back and straight forward. Dmitry's not fond of fighting on the inside. That's why he flies straight back. Now, to fight on the inside, of course, you do need to be able to change angles tight on right there on the spot. You need to be able to shift your weight quickly. You've got to be on the balls of your feet and make these small little angle changes. And instead of doing that, what BIVOL does is he just shells up, puts up his double high guard, kind of leans in and kind of curves his back forward to just kind of, just shell up and protect himself. So again, while he's been able to get away with using that as his defense mode when the action gets pushed to the inside, it's not an offensive posture. Now let's take a look at Artur BETERBIEV. So I think BETERBIEV's greatest asset is his jab overhand right or jab to his right uppercut. So very similar to Dmitry BIVOL, BETERBIEV also has a very effective jab. It's sharp, it's penetrating, and now while he doesn't waste any motion in terms of pawing the air at all, BETERBIEV basically saves his energy to throw hard single jabs. Now I'll circle back to explain why I think BETERBIEV developed that overhand right and tight right uppercut to the inside. Artur BETERBIEV's second terrific asset is the fact that he is willing to scrap on the inside. Now, nobody's going to accuse BETERBIEV of being as technical as, say, somebody like a Roberto Duran on the inside, but BETERBIEV is fully willing to throw down, tie up his opponent by getting an underhook and then whacking him with his free hand. Artur will also, push down on his opponent's head, or he'll get that underhook and then try to spin his opponent around to get them off balance. And he's willing to just push them down onto the canvas. So while none of these moves are technically scoring him any points, they're sort of just letting his opponent know, hey, you're in a fight and it's a scrap, and I'm willing to get ugly on the inside, so suck it up. And finally, the one thing that everybody says when they mention Artur BETERBIEV is his explosive power, and that's absolutely a great asset for him. Now, I'm going to point to two reasons why I think Artur developed or possesses the power that he does. First reason is while he was an amateur, BETERBIEV actually competed at the cruiserweight and then sometimes at the heavyweight divisions. Now, I'm not sure why that was. Perhaps it was politics, because there's always a lot of politicking in the amateur game, no matter what country you're from. But in any case, simply by having to get in the ring and endure punches from bigger foes, as well as obviously being forced to dish out stronger punches to deter heavier foes or to cause damage to heavier foes. That's how I think Artur developed the power that he now possesses as a light heavyweight. Certainly probably dropped, 20-25 pounds from when he was fighting as a cruiser or heavyweight. But simply by subjecting his body to dealing with much bigger opponents for a number of years, I believe that's how BETERBIEV developed that internal strength and power. Now, I'll make a little bit of an analogy. It's not a perfect analogy to lifting weights. So, for example, if you want to be able to lift heavier weights, I mean, it sounds obvious, but you have to actually pick up heavier weight. It's not going to help if you just do more reps. Like if you do 100 reps with 25-pound dumbbells, you can't one day then just go over and pick up the 40-pound dumbbells and expect to do, say, necessarily 20 reps or something. At some point, you're going to have to pick up the heavier dumbbells and certainly not do as many as you could. With the lighter weight. So BETERBIEV was subjected to absorbing more force generated by these cruiser and heavyweight amateurs, as well as having to muster up enough explosive power to dish it out to them as well. Now, the second factor that I think helped Artur maintain and develop his explosive power is the fact that he works with an absolutely legit strength coach. Those of you who've listened to me know that I'm not really fond of a lot of these so-called strength and conditioning coaches that get involved with professional boxing, because I feel they're just absolutely ignorant. For example, whoever those guys are that were working with Deontay Wilder, just absolutely incorrect. They allow him to use poor technique and do exercises that are just not going to help him develop any meaningful power for boxing or for any other sport for that matter. But by contrast, Artur's strength coach, I believe, is also Eastern European. Of course, now living and training in Montreal. But from the little bit of footage that I caught of Artur training with this coach, in my opinion, this gentleman is absolutely legit as a strength coach. Now, a true strength coach could work with any athlete in any sport. It doesn't have to be boxing per se. And I should also mention that doesn't mean that BIVOL doesn't also have a legit strength coach. I just have not been able to find footage of Dmitry, weight training, so I have no say in that one. But for sure, the fact that Artur has a legit strength coach, I'll assume this gentleman has just been able to help Artur maintain and improve on his explosive power. Let's look at a few areas of concern regarding BETERBIEV. So the first one for me is with his footwork. When Artur moves to his right, he doesn't overtly cross his left foot over his right foot, which would be his lead foot, over his back foot, but he almost crosses them, or at least puts them in line. And so for that instant, he's susceptible because he's off balance for a brief moment. Second area of concern for BETERBIEV is also somewhat footwork related, which is that every now and again he'll tend to kind of leap in to land punches on his opponent. That's a way for him to rapidly close distance, but in that moment he's also again susceptible, because if someone can time him, he's open for a big counter shot. Finally, I'm not, even though I said Artur is willing to scrap on the inside, he might also be a little bit susceptible on the inside. In his fight versus Callum Johnson, Johnson was able to drop Artur early on in the fight when they both traded simultaneous short left hooks on the inside. Now, of course, BETERBIEV went on to really kind of batter Johnson, but nevertheless, you know, if Artur's not working, you know, on tight defense on the inside, he could get caught in an exchange. So how does Artur BETERBIEV and Dmitry BIVOL, how do they match up? Well, if we take a look at, say, 5 different areas, in many senses, it looks like the fight's a draw, because both fighters have terrific jabs. Both fighters have responsible defense in terms of maintaining a good guard by keeping the right hand up, and also by having effective footwork to move in and out or around effectively. Both BIVOL and BETERBIEV are very good at throwing combination punches, and then knowing when the right moment is to just turn it up, turn it on, and just unleash those combinations. And finally, all these skills were developed during their extensive amateur career, and they both have about the same amount of experience as pros. So we have to dig a little deeper to really uncover sort of the differences between BETERBIEV and BIVOL that could affect the outcome of the fight. And the main one that I think is going to come into play is the fact that, you know, I'd like to look at their amateur experience. Because both fighters spent so much time and developed, you know, from young men or teenagers into full-grown men in the amateur system in Russia, I think it's a valid point. So if we look at BIVOL, he spent a lot of his amateur fights in the Eastern Bloc region, fighting other Eastern Bloc fighters. So as a result, Dmitry BIVOL is kind of the best of the Eastern European style. Clearly, he was able to, become national champion in Russia. That means he's better than all the other Russians at the Russian style of boxing. And then he was able to, you know, advance himself and do well within Europe, again, with that same style. Now, very similarly, Artur BETERBIEV also developed as a mature fighter under that Russian system. But there's one or two actually key differences. One is that I think that if you look at BETERBIEV's amateur record, he did actually fight more sort of global competition than BIVOL did. So that means he was exposed to, you know, a slightly bigger variety of amateur style of fighting than BIVOL. Specifically, we got to look at sort of the North American and the say the UK style of amateur fighting, which differs greatly from that Eastern European high guard, bouncing in and out in a lateral line type of motion. And really the second thing, and really the key difference here between BETERBIEV and BIVOL, is the fact that BETERBIEV again had to move up, or was asked to move up, to cruiserweight and then sometimes heavyweight. So I feel that what BETERBIEV did was he had to take that Eastern European style of in and out fighting, jab, 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 right hand, move laterally, start over again with the jab. He took that and he had to modify it in order to deal with guys who were considerably bigger than him. I mean, according to the stats, BETERBIEV is just under 6 feet tall. So you can imagine he's giving away a certain amount of size to cruiserweights and certainly heavyweights. And also in the amateur ranks, BETERBIEV came up against Usyk 3 times. I think he has 1 win and 2 losses to Usyk. He fought Ismail Silak, who you may remember. He also fought Alexander Vodzik. So, you know, BETERBIEV had to sort of hone his Eastern European style and modify it. This is where I think he started developing that overhand right, because for the shorter fighter, an overhand right is absolutely essential, bread and butter move. This is also where I think that BETERBIEV developed that tight little inside right uppercut straight into the chin of his opponents. So it's interesting to note that you know, while a lot of fighters will start to move up in weight divisions once they turn pro, BETERBIEV did the opposite, right? Again, for reasons known to only him and the Russian Federation, he was designated as a cruiserweight as an amateur. He did look a little, I wouldn't say he looked fluffy, but you could see he was definitely a little fuller, shall we say, as a cruiser / heavyweight amateur than he is now looking as a super or as a light heavyweight. So this is, as we say, therein lies the rub, right? I mean, while Dmitry BIVOL may be the absolute finest example of that Eastern European style being adapted to now fight in the pro ranks, this is something that BETERBIEV has seen from day one, because he comes from the same boxing program, boxing culture, right? BETERBIEV's been dealing with that in and out Eastern European style since he was a kid. And by him being forced to fight the bigger men, he had to then take that and add his own twist to it so he could deal with much taller, heavier fighters. So this is where I think the key difference is, or could be the key to the whole matchup, is the fact that BETERBIEV knows how to read that style. It'll almost be like, you know, second nature to him, or maybe it'll be first nature to him, to read that style and just recognize that, you know, I mean, I'm not sure if Dmitry BIVOL can show BETERBIEV anything that BETERBIEV hasn't already seen, or BETERBIEV doesn't know how to deal with. So, for example, that Eastern European jab hand. As I mentioned, you know, especially in the amateur ranks, the Eastern Europeans hold that jab hand out almost at their bicep is almost at shoulder level, and they will hold their forearm almost at 90 degrees to their bicep, so straight up in the air, and they kind of paw with it. It's motion to almost, as we say, occupy the air and maybe try to overload their opponent with just information, right? But they're not actually trying to land a penetrating jab every time they throw that left hand out there. They'll also kind of bend their knees and sort of level change, but again, not with the intention of actually throwing the jab to the body. It's just sort of level changing and moving themselves, which is they're moving the target area again to occupy their opponent mentally. But, you know, BETERBIEV again has been exposed to that since he was a youngster, so how much is that going to throw him off? But most importantly, it's the fact that BIVOL likes to fight on that straight line, linear path that I think Artur is just, you know, he's figured that one out a while ago, right? In order to be successful and become Russian national champion as a cruiserweight, as a shorter cruiserweight, and as a shorter even heavyweight, BETERBIEV had to develop his own sort of perhaps somewhat unorthodox way of moving and launching himself towards his opponent and throwing his punches. So the sort of quote-unquote common sense way for Dmitry to win this fight, in my opinion, would be for him to just continually stick to the jab, stay on the outside, and keep on the outside, pick away at BETERBIEV with his jab, and then typical for Eastern European fighter, when he feels the moment is right, drop in that straight right hand behind the jab, and if once he gets the 1-2 going, start dropping in the left hook behind the 1-2. But Bivol is not sort of that runaway fighter, shall we say. He's not really that fighter that wants to just secure a decision by pecking away at opponent and then running around the ring. I think Dmitry, it's just in his nature. He really wants to come in for the kill when he feels that he can. So I don't know that Bivol's willing to fight a play it safe fight. I just don't think that's in his nature. And that kind of, again, plays into BETERBIEV's hand. Because if the taller, longer fighter is in fact willing to come forward, that only helps out the shorter fighter. So while Bivol should stay on the outside if he wants to, eke out a victory via points, BETERBIEV just has to simply adjust. He has to close the distance, which it may mean, sort of launching himself explosively at Bivol as Bivol sort of retreats with his bounce back steps. Again, it puts him at a bit of a risk, but I'll assume that, BETERBIEV and his team have, figured out how to mitigate that risk as he's trying to close that distance suddenly. And once he's on the inside, BETERBIEV can just be happy to make it a really ugly scrap on the inside and just slowly sort of, or maybe not slowly, but try to just take it to Bivol on the inside. It doesn't. No one's giving out points for aesthetics in a boxing fight. So as long as BETERBIEV can get the mental upper hand and the physical sort of scrappiness over Bivol on the inside, then he's done his job. Because to me it appears like Dmitry Bivol absolutely does not want to fight on the inside. So bottom line for me, I feel that BETERBIEV can get a stoppage win versus Dmitry Bivol. I think that BETERBIEV can get the stoppage in the later rounds, maybe around rounds 9 or 10. He may be able to get a stoppage victory on Dmitry Bivol. Now, given Bivol's attributes, it is also possible that he could, I think, eke out a decision win over BETERBIEV, but I just don't feel that's as likely, simply because I don't think Bivol, as I said, is one of those fighters who's willing to literally just score punches and then run away for the majority of the fight, which is pretty much what he would need to do in order to eke out a decision win. So there you have my breakdown of BETERBIEV versus Bivol. Let me know your thoughts. Who do you think is going to win the fight, and how are they going to win the fight? If you enjoyed this boxing breakdown, please consider hitting the subscribe button and also hit the notification button. If you'd like to have priority replies from me in terms of the comments, and if you'd like to have early access to our videos, please also consider joining as a member. We are having some terrific discussions within our membership community. And as always, if you'd like to show your love, you're welcome to scroll over to the right and leave a super thanks, or head over to buymeacoffee.com/Hamaguchi Fight and buy a coffee for $5 US.